moderate to severe hot flashes, the ones that wake you up at night, the ones that drive you crazy, they were cut by 84% in the diet group. And the average woman lost about 8 pounds. It was a 12-week period. And women started describing this as this amazing life-changing experience where instead of trying to make up their mind if they needed to go to the drug counter and get a prescription, the cure was in their kitchen. It was in their hands, not somebody else's hands. And so they wanted to then become advocates for this kind of thing. And since that time, we've been doing classes for other women. And the women who had originally participated in the research now want to teach other women to kind of get out of the doctor's office and take care of their own health.
Indeed, that's beautiful. It passes from person to person. And who better to coach a woman going through this than a woman who's gone through it? And yet there are people who say that the eating pattern that you advocate and that we also do is too radical. And while it may be effective, it's too restrictive. And they say that life is full of uncertainties. And when they die, they want to be sure that they've lived life to the full. And they use that as a reason not to change their diets. And Neil, how would you respond to someone who thinks that way?
Oh, good heavens. I guess the first thing to say is that it is much easier than a person is imagining. We're at an Italian restaurant. Do you have the spaghetti with ground beef on top or the spaghetti with the chunky tomato sauce on top? It's as simple as that. It's really an easy choice and it's not hard. Or instead of meat chili, I have the bean chili. Or the vegetable stir fry or the veggie burger instead of the meat burger. It's super simple, but when we talk about being restricted, I have to tell you, I have almost a recurrent nightmare. When I was an intern, 4 o'clock in the morning, my pager went off. And it was a woman I knew in the hospital. And I knew her because she'd been there for 5 weeks. She had a gangrenous foot from type 2 diabetes that was poorly controlled. And she was on the orthopedic surface for an amputation of her foot. She refused the amputation. And she said, I'm not going to let you take off my foot. And we said, look, this is going to kill you. You've got a festering infection here. And the only answer was I put an IV in her arm and I just pumped her with antibiotics. I said, I'm going to save this damn foot if I can. And we just kept her there in the hospital bed on IV antibiotics to try to knock out the infection. And so every now and then her IV would clog off and it would usually be 4 o'clock in the morning. And there I was with my needle to get the IVs going again. Bottom line, she was discharged with her foot still intact. And that meant that we were wrong about the need for the amputation. It was possible to say, but now I'm guessing that eventually she lost that battle, but at least for the time being, we could keep it attached. But the thing is, we were wrong in a much, much bigger way. For the entire 6 weeks that she was in the hospital, we talked to her about antibiotics, we talked to her about her blood sugars. Not once did anybody suggest that if she made bigger changes in her diet, she might be able to not just save her foot, but save her vision, maybe save her life. And the reason we didn't say that is because we didn't have the research that showed it was true. We didn't know it at that time. So the reason I'm mentioning this is a person says, isn't this kind of restrictive to have beans? Isn't it kind of restrictive to have the veggie lasagna instead of the meat lasagna? And I think of how restrictive it is to be in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV, not being able to leave, wondering how many feet you're going to have on you when your loved ones come and take you home. We start to die when we're in our 30s sometimes with extra weight and more medicines and our blood pressure's up, and we get more restricted by the things that have occurred as a result of our diet choices. And it is so liberating to be able to turn all that around.
It is, and it's also made more difficult in our society by the excess of highly processed foods that are everywhere in our food world. And one of the things that bothers me the most, actually, is that the food companies that produce these foods that are everywhere have hired what they call craveability experts. That's the actual industry term. These are scientists, and they're hired to engineer and to market food products with what the industry calls enhanced craveability quotients. And they provide these scientists with enormous budgets and highly sophisticated labs. What this means to me is that they're going to great lengths and they're spending enormous sums to make their food products as addictive as possible, really. And there's a man, Howard Moskowitz. He's the guy who developed the concept of the bliss point that enables food companies to create the greatest amount of crave. And he was asked about the relationship between these foods and the obesity crisis. And his answer, I think, is telling. He said, "There's no moral issue for me. I don't have the luxury of being a moral creature." Now, Neil, it seems to me that this kind of thinking, this amoral thinking, is being used as a rationalization for creating and marketing foods that are devastating public health. And it really does bother me greatly when people feel that their food addiction, their cravings, are some kind of moral failing on their part, when it isn't at all that way. It's the result of food science being used to hook people and to exploit the fact that some of us are more susceptible than others. Neil, how do you see this?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it is frightening to see how people, just as you said, there are teams of scientists who know exactly what is the combination of sugar and cocoa butter that makes your chocolate bar absolutely irresistible. And they have those formulas and they are continually refining them. And researchers have found there are other ways to make things addictive too. Dairy products, as you know, have the casomorphins in them that are the mild opiates that can be concentrated as well. And so it's not exactly as addicting as morphine, but it's in this very much the same direction. And in fact, it affects the very same receptors in the brain. But I think the question of moral responsibility is something that people are starting to wake up to. When I was a resident at GW Hospital in Washington, D.C., finishing my residency, I would walk into the hospital in the morning and stop in the gift shop and I'd buy Merit menthols and I would light up on the way down the hall. And my head of surgery would buy Marlboros and he'd light up too. And we weren't stupid. We knew it caused cancer, but we figured, well, I'm under stress now. It takes time to get cancer. I'll quit later. At some point, the hospital came to the realization that this is not a bar and grill. This is a hospital. And what message are we giving to our patients and to the visitors and frankly to our own staff if we actually sell these products that we know cause cancer? And when our gift shop threw out the tobacco, and we made a decision as a hospital that we were going to not embrace tobacco anymore, everybody quit. We all quit. We are now having that very same discussion about the hospital cafeteria. If we know that bacon causes colorectal cancer, why are we serving it in the hospital cafeteria? Well, the answer is maybe we're not going to anymore.
Good.
So that discussion is happening, and that is a good thing. The idea is, yes, we do have some moral responsibility, or if not, let's take it on. Let's see if we can't make a healthier community. And here in Washington, D.C., when we look at our map of who gets colorectal cancer, who dies of it, there is an enormous racial disparity here and a geographic disparity. And there are many ways to try to attack that, but one way is with the kinds of foods that people see and learn about when you're passing through a medical facility. Let's model the very best. And so that's what we're trying to do here.
Well, speaking of tobacco, the World Health Organization and the International Agency for Research on Cancer has formally declared processed meat to be a proven carcinogen to humans. This puts processed meat in the same category as asbestos and the AIDS virus. But you mentioned that hospitals are still serving, some of them, processed meats that are known to cause cancer. The Children's Hospital of Georgia recently closed the McDonald's restaurant that was located inside the lobby of the hospital.
Finally.
Neil, what role did you and your organization, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, play in this coming about, the closing of this McDonald's restaurant in this hospital?
Well, I want to give some credit to William Castelli from the Framingham Heart Study, because he said words that I have never forgotten. He said that when you see the golden arches, you might be on the road to the pearly gates. And I thought, that is so perfect. So anyway, after I remember him saying that, and I happened to notice at the hospital that I was lecturing at, they had a McDonald's on the ground floor. Now that would not be a bad thing if McDonald's was serving really uniformly healthy food. There's nothing wrong with arches. It's just a question of what they have on the menu. And so we, a number of years ago, started saying hospitals that contract out to fast food chains have to end that relationship. And we've been successful with that. And sometimes you have to roll up your sleeves and push a little bit. But what we do, I have to say, we keep track of when the contracts are coming toward their end, so that the hospital is negotiating with them. And then we have our people in white coats standing out in front of the hospital saying, why are you serving foods in this hospital that are killing children, killing adults, creating these pandemics of disease? And the hospital does not like that kind of bad image. And so we've been very, very successful in knocking them out.
Well, I want to thank you for your efforts in that regard. And it is like smoking. It wasn't that long ago, as you were referring to, that doctors smoked and were portrayed in ads that were marketing specific brands. More doctors smoke Camels.
Okay,
These
30
ads were being
second
shown to the public at
rest.
a time when
Drink water.
It was just a remarkable result to see. So anyway, I want to thank our friends at Civil Memorial Hospital here in Washington, D.C., who jumped in and said, yes, let's do this.
There are so many advantages to eating a whole food plant-based diet, but there are commercial interests that want to keep the veil in place over people's eyes and keep people from knowing what would in fact enhance the quality of their lives immeasurably. And one of those entities, I think, is the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which describes itself as working to advance the economic, political, and social interests of the U.S. cattle business. Now, you'll notice there's nothing in that mission statement about public health. And so the Beef Association has recently placed ads in the Wall Street Journal and in other major newspapers that downplay, significantly downplay. The whole intention is to downplay the beef industry's impact on the climate crisis. And this is coming at a time when the evidence that beef is playing a huge role in the climate crisis continues to mount. A study published just last August in the journal Nature Food, just to cite one example, evaluated 6,000 foods and ranked them by their impact on the environment and found that beef was number one. Beef had by far the largest carbon footprint of all 6,000 foods that they assessed. Neil, I know that the Physicians Committee has filed a petition with the FTC about this. It seems to me, and I know to you, that the Beef Association's propaganda isn't just wrong and misleading, it's dangerous and it's hurting people.
Yep.
And it's compromising our future.
Killing
What's your
people.
view of all this?
There, at this point, is just
Thank you,
no
sweetheart.
question that the climate is changing, and there's also no question that our diet contributes to it. And you just can't have tens of millions of belching cattle with methane rising above them, with this being a tremendously potent greenhouse gas. There's just no way that this is not a cause of the climate change that we're seeing. And so we do have to take action, and unfortunately there are people who have an economic interest in trying to make that all go away, and they're paid to do that. That said, I often think of cattle ranchers. They're not our enemies. My dad grew up in the cattle business, and my grandfather did too, and his father, and my uncles and my cousins are still in that business today. So they're not our enemies, they're really our family. They will have the same heart disease and cancer risk. They will be suffering in the same lost planet as all the rest of us. So
They need to be
it is
educated.
true that we go to the federal government to stop them from putting out these kinds of absurd ads. We have to counter their effects, but it's with the idea that this is a family member and we've got our hand on their shoulder saying, look, let's work together to change this. The tobacco industry did the same thing a generation ago. They were trying to make bad news go away. And those were honest people who got into a business before the risks were known. As the risks were known, we had to speak out. We had to help them to transition into something else. And that's what animal agriculture is going to do. They are going to have to transition into other kinds of work, and there are plenty of other things to do. And we're seeing this, especially in the dairy industry now. The dairy farmers are going out of business left and right. And they're not bad people. They're people trying to feed their families who happen to be doing what turns out to be a very bad thing, slaughtering animals and doing really unfortunate things to them. But we all profit. We all get better when we can change our economy so that we're supporting healthy activities and healthy industries.
Well, when you say that their family, I have a very personal connection to what you're saying. My dad and my uncle founded Baskin-Robbins, the ice cream company that became, during my childhood, the world's largest ice cream company. It was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And my uncle, Bert Baskin, very big guy who ate a lot of ice cream, died of a heart attack at the age of 54. And my father ate a lot of ice cream, and he developed a very serious diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease and the whole thing of it. However, he did have an awakening. He did come to see that the diet that he had been eating and the ice cream that he'd been selling were a big part of the problem, and he changed his diet and he reversed his diabetes. It went into complete remission. He no longer needed insulin. He no longer needed metformin or any other diabetic pill. Same thing would happen with his high blood pressure. It completely normalized, and he no longer needed the meds he'd been told he'd have to take for the rest of his life. And he lost weight, and he lived a lot longer and healthier years than he had any expectation of before making those shifts. So, and I watched him. He didn't know when he established the company that ice cream contributed to heart disease. He didn't know that the dairy industry was cruel to the animals involved. He didn't know these things, and frankly, he didn't want to know. But when that information, partly through my efforts, became impossible for him to ignore, he made changes, and he pretty well saved his life. And I think it's really important when we are interacting with people who seem to represent the industries, or who do in fact represent the industries, or even own the industries that are pushing a bad diet on people, that we remember somehow that they're human beings, and we're all human beings. And that if we can speak to them and interact with them, yes, we want to stop the bad things they're doing. But at the same time, if we can keep compassion in our hearts for them as human beings, then I think have a better chance of being effective in the long run.
Sure, I think there's no question about it. Everybody is involved in this in one way or another, but we all kind of get hooked on foods that are less than healthy and so forth. And yet the beauty of it is that when you make these changes and you adopt a healthy diet, it doesn't feel restrictive. Oh my, I loved ice cream, now it's all gone. You think it's gonna be like that, but it turns out to be very different. When I was growing up in North Dakota, every day of my life it was roast beef, baked potatoes, and corn, and pretty simple diet. And it's true that when I got that out of my routine, I wasn't entirely sure what to eat for maybe a week or two. But now, I live in Washington, D.C., and if I leave my office and I go down the block, there's an Italian place that'll make an angel hair pasta with a marinara sauce, tomato sauce, and arrabbiata sauce, which is Italian for angry, because it's a spicy tomato sauce. And next to it, there's a sushi place that will make a cucumber roll or an asparagus roll and miso soup and seaweed salads. And then down the block, there's an Indian restaurant with wonderful curries, a Chinese restaurant not too far away, vegetables, tofu, rice dishes. And if you told me, no, you can't have any of that stuff, go back to Fargo and just have your roast beef, baked potatoes, and corn, I'd say, wait a minute, what I eat now is more varied, more interesting, more diverse than anything I grew up with. So the pleasures of life aren't gone any more than if you told me I can't be a non-smoker anymore, I have to go back to enjoying my menthol cigarettes, which I had when I was younger. That to me would not add to my life at all. So being free of some of these bad things is a great, great transition. And so when you've got a family member, or in our case, patients who come in, or research participants, and you guide them to making these changes, they very soon they discover that their whole quality of life is improving just dramatically, and they're just so glad to be there for the ride.
It's wonderful to be able to provide a service that people can receive with so much benefit to their lives. And Neil, it's always a great pleasure for me to speak with you, to learn from you, and to bring your knowledge and your wisdom and your compassion to our listeners. Right now, there are hundreds of thousands of people listening to us. Is there anything you want to say to them as we conclude this conversation?
John, you probably don't know this, but it was many decades ago that I was inspired by somebody who was talking about a power that we didn't know we had, and that was the power to change the environment. And this huge, immovable thing of our environment was something that we could change based on what we ate, and what we ate every day, and what we fed to our families. And that person was you, John. And I thought, okay, he's got some real knowledge that we need to take advantage of, and look what he's doing, he's changing the world. And for me in my medical career, we're doing this hopefully in our own way. But what I realized, what you've taught me, what Ocean's taught me, and others working in much the same direction, is that everybody has a place on this team in our own way. So a person is a teacher in school, or they're a school nurse, or they're working in a factory, or they're working in HR somewhere. We all have a way to help the people that we're working with to take the power of healthy eating into their hands and to advocate in a gentle but hopefully reasonably authoritative way to move away from a diet that is not just hurting animals or hurting the earth, but frankly, it's hurting our coronary arteries and making our kids worry about us. We can turn that whole thing around. So I'm grateful to you for giving me that realization a long time ago, and I'm grateful that we've got a team that people can join. And if someone is listening to this wanting to take that power in their hands, I would just ask them not to hesitate.
Don't hesitate. Good advice, Neil. Really good advice. And thank you for that acknowledgement, too. I really want to thank you, Neil, for your clarity, your courage, for the enormous contributions you've been making for decades to the health and to the ethics of our society. We're more moral people, we're better people, we're healthier people, we have a better chance of having a livable future thanks to our efforts. On behalf of myself and Ocean and everyone involved in the
All right, we'll do one more. Woo! Nice job, guys. Now we're going to do some stretching and cooling down. Nice job. High five. Good job.